Segregation in our nation's public schools is returning, but probably not where you think. According to a report published by the Civil Rights Project at UCLA, school segregation may be a rising problem in the U.S. It's still not at the levels that it was, pre-1954 Brown versus Board of Education, but it is on the rise. 23% of African American students went to schools that were majority white, and that's the lowest number since 1968. New York, Michigan, Maryland, and Illinois are kind of the four really big offenders of on this. More than 50% of black students attended schools where 90% of the school is the minority, are minority students. Obviously, 90% would not be the minority. And the same is true for Latino students in New York, California, and Texas. So with the exception of Texas, we've got some traditionally liberal states here really dropping the ball when it comes to racial representation in our public schools. There's a lot of reasons for this. Obviously, it's a big, complicated issue. America's a huge country with a complicated racial history. But housing segregation is probably the primary culprit, according to the author of the report, Gary Orfield. And I quote, neighborhood schools, when we go back to them as we have, produce middle-class schools for whites and Asians and segregated high-poverty schools for blacks and Latinos. That's just what the data bears out. That's not a statement of ideology. That's a reflection of the data. Other reasons include, of course, migrations of affluence, or commonly referred to as white flight, which leads to poor schools getting poorer, less trained teachers, and even the possibility of, if you want to take a free market approach, of less talented teachers, because obviously your good teachers. I mean, teachers, hey, they're great people, but they're still human beings. They want to go where the good employment opportunities are. And so most of them are probably going to try to go to better schools. And this is a huge problem we have in America, where we fund schools based on property taxes and stuff like that. So the more wealthy your neighborhood is, the more wealthy your school is, and it perpetuates that cycle. One thing that's really interesting in this study is how the schools, we kind of hinted at this earlier, fare regionally. The Northeast is more intensely segregated than before 1968. The Midwest, West, and border states are next on the list. They're less segregated than they were in the 60s, so they're not back above 68 levels, but they're more segregated now than they were in the 80s and 90s. And then Southern schools are the least segregated schools in the United States. Now, a lot of that, that's not necessarily a reflection of progressive policies in the South. It's a reflection of population. I know where I grew up in the Delta, when I was in elementary school, I was actually the minority, and it got closer to 50-50 as I got older and into high school. But that's that's just kind of what you have going on in the South. And also in the South, poverty is kind of a great equalizer, especially in the Delta region of the South, where you've just got massive poverty. And so what you've got are poor white folks and poor black folks, and the white folks can't afford to move out. And so there is a lot of integration across communities, just because the things that other white people have done across the country, white folks in the Delta can't afford to do. But that's also why you have a lot of racial tension, because you don't have a clear minority. You've got a 50-50 split in the population, and there's ignorance across both segments of the population. And we know that where there's ignorance and lack of education and great intensity of need and poverty, you tend to have less than favorable outcomes amongst those communities. In conclusion, the report states further research is needed to effectively analyze the problem across the U.S., and the authors pushed President Obama to take this situation seriously. Of course, so far the White House has offered no major encouragement nor incentives for working on integration. And of course, we can imagine what kind of field day the right wing would have if Mr. Obama did that. But you know what, Mr. Obama, it's your second term. Man up and take some shots. Anyway, that's my 2 cents. Becca, let's start with you this time. You're I don't want to give away too much, but education hits close to home for you. So what do you have to say?
Actually, I will say that it really doesn't surprise me to see Illinois on that list, and to see the South being less segregated even as these old attitudes are maintained. I distinctly remember having a conversation with a friend from Illinois way back in undergrad, talking to the person who was at that time directing some of my studies in African American literature, and her saying, well, there aren't black characters in that book because there just aren't black characters in that area. Well, then I went to visit her in her hometown, and 30 minutes away there is a town that is black. And in all of my years in living in Oklahoma, I had never been in a white town and then a black town. That was completely foreign to my experiences. And so I think it's something that isn't talked about as much, and so it becomes easier to let it slide. It becomes a Southern problem. The South has a problem with race, the North doesn't. I think that in recent years that's gotten better. But I think that especially maybe 10, 15 years ago, it was very easy to say, well, it's the South that has the race problem, so they're the ones who should be worried about it. That said, the South does still have a race problem. Not least because, as you point out, the people who perhaps have the best opportunity to be overcoming some of this don't always have the education to be understanding the flaws in these kinds of patterns of thought. So none of that surprises me, even as I find myself yet again sort of stumped as far as a solution goes. I mean, what do? Do you make small children miserable by busing them into districts where they feel unhappy and uncomfortable? Or do you say, well, we're going to try to force teachers into some other... Our education system has so many other complications right now that it's difficult to say where you even start with that specific question.
Yeah. And busing is a solution that's got, so much baggage attached to it. And it's one of those things where I think it's undeniable at a point in time in American history that was what had to be done. As tough as it was and as unpleasant as it was, drastic steps had to be taken. So the question is, are we still there? And we may very well be. I don't know that we are. I don't feel qualified to say yes or no on that. I do think one thing that is an obvious solution is we've got to get away from this just stupid property tax model of funding public schools that we have now, because it so exacerbates the situation. And I think if we move to a model where poorer areas with poorer schools do not get inherently less funding, then you make the schools in those bad areas, even ever so slightly, you make them more attractive, or at least stop the hemorrhaging as opposed to them just running down, and then maybe this is me giving human beings way too much credit, but you don't have to bus people because the schools become organically a more attractive option. People are more okay with their kids going to places like that. That's obviously, again, to reference the phrase from the earlier story, that's not a silver bullet. Changing the tax model is not all of a sudden, going to mean we've got great schools all the way across the board. But that is very clearly just a foundational, fundamental problem in the way we do. And I know we try to stem that. We try to patch it, with a Band-Aid with outside funding and other places like that. But the problem, if I could, not to get into a diatribe here, but we've seen with the Voters' Rights Act being gutted, stuff like that. There's a push to because some of these institutional problems that were big in the South, why the things that the South caught flack for, rightly, they've gone away on an institutional level. A lot of those safeguards are now being stripped away legislatively, and I think schools are just another example of that. In Arkansas, there was I really should have done my research here. I know there was a debate. I'm pretty sure it got pulled away. Arkansas used to have a little fund set aside where money from wealthier districts, a certain percentage of it, ended up going to poorer districts. And if I'm not mistaken, that went away this year. I know at the very least it came really close. So if it didn't happen, that discussion is happening. And so that's that's an incomplete solution in the first place to say, oh, well, we'll take a little bit of extra money and throw it your way. We need a systemic change, but it not only because the Band-Aid approach doesn't work, but because the Band-Aid can be ripped off before the wound heals. You've got to get down and actually fix the wound. Sean, what do you have to say for yourself? Why is your state so racist?
Yeah, so I will explain New York in a minute, but in New Jersey, they actually have Supreme Court decisions, their state Supreme Court, called Abbott cases that you guys should look into, where they equalize the poorer districts with the wealthier districts. so they all get the same amount of funding. It didn't improve any of the districts because the state money mostly got wasted. So like I always have like that issue. I don't think the public education problem is a funding issue. I think it's more of a mismanagement of or misallocation of resources and like those kind of problems. But to explain why,
let me cut you off. Let me cut you off because you're absolutely right. Which is why you should never point to New Jersey as an example to make a point. You're going to say it's not a point of funding, it's a point of misallocation. Then you don't point to Jersey, man.
well,
That's what they're known for, is sucking.
They systemically changed the way their schools were funded. It was a court decision. It's irreversible.
Yeah, but you got to reform Jersey before you can use Jersey as reform.
It's been over a decade for them trying it. I mean, it's not just Chris, but in New York, this totally makes sense because everybody is basically on the zip code system. You go to the school in your zip code. Now, I live in probably a very diverse zip code because I've always had a large number of Asian kids, a large number of Hispanic kids, a large number of white kids, all going to the same schools for like my life. Also, a large number of black kids. I don't know why I randomly left them out. But if I drive 15 minutes that way and go to the school that's to that zip code, then it's like an all-black school. If I drive, or a majority black school, if I drive that way, it's all Asian schools. So most of it is just like the zip code model. And it wouldn't take much effort in a place like New York where people are densely populated for you to solve this problem with busing. You wouldn't have to bus people for hours and hours. So it is doable locally over here, but like nobody really just seems to care. It's like it's New York, we're a liberal state, so everything must be fine or something. So like I think it's a mixture of we're not really, I guess we're not too concerned about integration of the schools anymore, and it's a little bit of self-segregating because a lot of people when they come here, they move to, like, if you're Indian, you move to an Indian community. If you're Greek, you move to a Greek community. Like, so it's a lot of it is self-segregation. A lot of it is, like, I don't think it comes from, like, a place of evil, but I just think, like, a place of hatred. I think it comes from the zip code system, and we're just so, like, set on you have to go to the school near you because somebody decided that years and years and years ago. So I think it's more that than an actual racial problem.
Yeah, no, and that's totally true. Like human beings, like, we seek out people that, we're more like. I mean, hell, look at our panel here. We're Livy, McLiberson, and Sean, and we're all, kind of middle class white folks. Sean, I know you're not, whatever. Yeah, but and like it's just human nature. You go to people who are like you. And so, like Sean said, that in and of itself is not necessarily evil. It does, however, open the door. It's really easy to manipulate that kind of more neutral habit we have. And Birmingham, Alabama is a great example of that. Like, Birmingham is a city where instead of having, like in Dallas, you got Dallas, and then you've got all, the Metroplex, or now it's Dallas-Fort Worth, and it's all one city, and every city from here to here is Dallas now, because it grew together. Birmingham is kind of the opposite. Birmingham doesn't have suburbs that Birmingham grew into. Birmingham has tiny cities within Birmingham that are based on, like, literally like you live across the street and you're in a different city, because they are the nicer districts that whenever Birmingham schools were segregated, pulled out of Birmingham so they could form their own school district. So you have all these tiny neighborhood cities in Birmingham, and it's just this bizarre setup. But to Sean's point, the zip code system is not inherently this evil school-wrecking thing, but it makes it really easy to kind of exploit some more innocuous tendencies of human nature and do that.